"The wedding is off," Brandon practically announced, loud enough to make the entire restaurant come to a standstill. His mates at the side table? Oh, they were all geared up, phones out, ready to catch me crumble. But here's the kicker. I didn't even blink back a tear. Instead, I slipped off the ring, tucked it into my pocket, and with a bit of a cheeky smile I said, "Guess I'll be throwing myself a narrow escape party then." And trust me, what unfolded next was something Brandon never saw coming. I did not rush. That was the strangest part. My legs moved, steady and controlled, carrying me away from the table while the room stayed frozen behind me. I could feel the stares on my back, sharp and curious, like everyone was waiting for me to collapse the second I reached the door. No one followed. No one stopped me. The silence did all the talking. The moment I stepped outside, the noise hit me at once. Traffic. Distant laughter. A couple arguing down the street. Life carrying on like nothing had just shattered. The cool air brushed against my face, and for a second it felt unreal, like I was watching myself from the outside. My hands were still calm. My breathing was slow. That scared me more than tears would have. I walked toward my car, heels clicking against the pavement, each step louder than it should have been. My reflection flashed briefly in the dark window of a parked car. Wedding dress. Perfect hair. A face that looked composed, almost untouched. Inside, though, something had started to crack. Once I closed the car door, the world shrank. The noise dulled. The space felt tighter. I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, waiting for the breakdown everyone expected. It did not come. Instead, there was a hollow feeling in my chest, like all the air had been pulled out and not replaced. My heart was warning me that something enormous had just happened, but my mind refused to catch up. Thoughts moved slowly, carefully, as if they were afraid to touch the truth. "So this is real," the words echoed quietly. No drama. No panic. Just a dull realization settling in. I thought about how confident he had sounded. How prepared. How certain he was that I would fall apart right there in front of his audience. The image replayed in my head, and for the first time my stomach tightened. Not from heartbreak, from recognition. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. My chest felt heavy now, like the weight had finally found me. My throat burned, but still no tears came. Just pressure. Just shock. Just the sense that the life I had walked into that restaurant with no longer existed. I started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, one thought stayed with me, sharp and unsettling. What he planned for me had only just begun to unravel. I met him at a time when my life felt simple and opened. I was not looking for anything dramatic. I had just started to feel settled in my routine, comfortable with who I was and where I was going. My days were busy, my evenings quiet, and my plans felt like they finally belonged to me. We met through mutual friends, one of those casual introductions that does not feel important at first. No sparks flying across the room. No movie-style moment. Just a conversation that flowed easily, the kind that makes time slip without you noticing. He listened. That was what stood out first. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered small details I mentioned in passing, things most people forget within minutes. It felt genuine. It felt attentive. It felt safe. When he asked for my number, it did not feel rushed or forced. It felt natural, like the next logical step rather than a risk. Our first few dates were easy in that same way. Coffee turning into long walks. Quick dinners stretching into late nights. The kind of connection that feels calm instead of overwhelming. I told myself that was maturity. He was confident but not loud. Charming but not flashy. He carried himself like someone who knew where he was headed, and I found comfort in that certainty. Being around him felt grounding, like I could lean without falling. Trust built quietly. He showed up when he said he would. He texted back. He remembered plans. He spoke about the future in a way that included me without making promises that felt too big too fast. When he complimented me, it felt thoughtful rather than rehearsed. I let my guard down without realizing it. There were moments early on when I noticed how much he liked being admired. How he seemed a little brighter when people were watching. I brushed it off as confidence. Everyone likes appreciation, right? When he introduced me to his friends, he was proud. When he posted pictures of us, he tagged me immediately. When people commented, he responded. It felt flattering. It felt reassuring. It felt like being chosen, and I trusted the version of him he showed me. He made me feel seen. Like my presence added something to his life. He talked about building something together, about stability, about doing things the right way. Nothing sounded alarming. Nothing sounded wrong. Looking back, that is what makes the beginning so dangerous. There were no obvious warning signs. No sharp edges. No moments that screamed, walk away. Just warmth. Just consistency. Just enough affection to make me believe I had found someone solid, that I did not fall hard all at once, that I stepped in slowly, confidently, believing I was walking towards something real, unaware that trust, once given quietly, is also taken quietly long before you notice it slipping away to everyone else. He was impressive. He knew how to enter a room and immediately feel comfortable in it. He shook hands with confidence, smiled at the right moments, and spoke with just enough charm to leave a good impression without trying too hard. People listened when he talked. People trusted him quickly. When we were out together, he was attentive in public. He held doors open. He laughed easily. He placed a hand on my back as if to signal that I belonged there, that we were solid. Friends would pull me aside and tell me how lucky I was. Family members nodded approvingly. Strangers assumed we were happy, that I believed them, that I in private. Though things felt different in ways I could not immediately explain, he was quieter when no one was watching. Less curious. Less patient. Conversations shifted subtly. If I talked too long, he would interrupt. If I disagreed, he would smile and reframe it as me being emotional or overthinking. It was never said harshly. It was said calmly, which made it harder to question. Public praise came easily. Private criticism came carefully. If I wore something he liked, he made sure others noticed. If I wore something he did not approve of, he mentioned it later, behind closed doors, framed as concern. He had a way of making it sound reasonable, like he was helping me improve rather than controlling the narrative. I started editing myself without realizing it. Around other people, he was generous and supportive. He told stories that made him look thoughtful and balanced. When we disagreed, he laughed it off in public, presenting himself as the calm one. Later, alone, he would explain how my reaction had been inappropriate or unnecessary. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. The contrast confused me. When someone is kind in public and critical in private, you start questioning your own perception. I wondered if I was too sensitive, too reactive, too demanding. He never directly blamed me, but the implication always lingered. Over time, I trusted his version of events more than my own feelings. People admired him. That mattered to him. Their approval seemed to fuel something inside him. Compliments landed deeper than conversations. Being seen as impressive mattered more than being understood. I noticed how relaxed he was when others were around, how alert he became when eyes were on us. It was like he performed a role effortlessly, then set it down once the audience disappeared. I told myself this was normal. Everyone has layers. Everyone behaves differently in private, but slowly, the gap between the man everyone loved and the man I lived with grew wider. I did not realize it at the time, but I was learning how easily a polished image can hide quiet control, and how dangerous it is to trust someone who cares more about how they are perceived than how they make you feel when no one else is watching. At first, the changes were small enough to feel harmless. He did not demand anything outright. He suggested. He hinted. He framed everything as logic, as care, as what made sense for us. And because I wanted the relationship to work, I listened. When he said my friends were a bit much, I laughed it off and saw them less. When he mentioned that certain plans did not really fit our future, I adjusted without arguing. When he questioned my decisions, he did it gently, with a tone that sounded reasonable enough to trust. I told myself this was compromise. If he did not like a restaurant I loved, we stopped going. If he thought my schedule was too busy, I rearranged it. If he believed my priorities needed shifting, I considered it seriously. None of it felt dramatic in the moment. It felt like choosing peace. I remember the first time I changed my mind just to avoid a discussion. I had wanted to spend a weekend away with friends. He paused, looked at me, and asked if that was really necessary. He did not say no. He did not stop me. He just made it feel inconvenient. I canceled the trip and told myself it was not a big deal. That became a pattern. Each decision on its own seemed insignificant. Together they reshaped my life. I stopped doing things that made me feel like myself and started doing things that made things easier. Easier for him. Quieter for us. I convinced myself that love required flexibility. That giving a little of myself was part of building something bigger. I ignored the fact that the giving only went one way. He praised me when I adapted. He pulled back when I resisted. That taught me quickly. I learned how to anticipate his preferences before he voiced them. I learned how to soften my opinions so they sounded agreeable. I learned how to let things go, even when they mattered to me. People around us saw stability. They saw us aligning. They saw a couple growing together. They did not see how much of myself I had slowly set aside to keep things smooth. Neither did I. I told myself this was what grown relationships looked like. Mature. Balanced. Thoughtful. I mistook my shrinking for harmony and my silence for understanding. By the time I noticed how quiet my own voice had become, it felt too late to ask. When I stopped being fully present in my own life, I thought I was choosing love. I did not realize I was practicing disappearance, one compromise at a time. The red flags were never loud. That is why I missed them. They showed up as jokes that landed a second too late, as comments disguised as concern, as corrections slipped into conversations when other people were listening. Nothing obvious enough to confront, but sharp enough to linger. He had a habit of correcting me in public. If I mispronounced a word, he would smile and repeat it the right way, lightly, as if helping. If I told a story and skipped a detail, he would jump in to clarify, steering it in a direction that made him sound informed and me sound slightly careless. People laughed. I smiled along, telling myself it did not matter. Later, alone, I would replay those moments and feel a quiet discomfort I could not fully explain. He commented on my reactions. If I got excited, I was being dramatic. If I felt hurt, I was taking things too personally. If I questioned something, I was overthinking. The words were consistent, delivered calmly, always framed as observations rather than criticism. I started monitoring myself. I learned when to speak less, when to laugh things off, when to let moments pass even if they bothered me. It felt easier than explaining why something hurt when I already knew how the conversation would end. He liked having the upper hand. He made more money, and he made sure I was aware of it without ever saying it directly. He paid for things, then referenced it later when decisions came up. Vacations, dinners, plans. His generosity came with an invisible expectation of agreement. If I suggested something different, he would remind me how much effort he already put in. The implication was clear. Gratitude should look like compliance. He enjoyed an audience. I noticed how his tone changed when others were around, how confident he became, how relaxed. He seemed energized by attention, by admiration, by being seen as the reasonable one. In those moments, I felt like a supporting character rather than a partner. When I challenged him privately, he dismissed it as misunderstanding. He said I was reading too much into things, that I was imagining tension where there was none, that my feelings were valid but unnecessary. The way he said it made me doubt myself instead of him. That is how subtle humiliation works. It does not insult you outright. It makes you question your own instincts. It makes you feel foolish for noticing patterns. It trains you to ignore the part of yourself that feels uneasy. I told myself I was lucky. He was successful, charismatic, admired. I reasoned that no relationship was perfect and that these were small imperfections I should not magnify. So I stayed quiet. I smoothed things over. I adjusted. I excused behavior that made me smaller because it was easier than admitting something was wrong. By the time I recognized the pattern, I had already learned how to live around it. What I did not understand yet was that control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like patience, wrapped in politeness, quietly teaching you to accept less than you deserve. The proposal should have been my first real warning. It did not happen in a quiet moment or a private space. It happened in front of people. A lot of people. Family gathered close. Friends already positioned. Phones raised before I even understood what was happening. He had planned it carefully. The timing was perfect. The setting was impressive. The reactions were guaranteed. When he dropped to one knee, there was a collective gasp, followed by applause that arrived right on cue. Before I could fully process the moment, I felt surrounded by expectation. Everyone was watching. He smiled broadly, confident and steady, delivering words that sounded rehearsed in the best possible way. He spoke about commitment, about the future, about choosing me. The crowd leaned in, emotionally invested in a moment they believed was genuine. I said yes. Not because I had doubts, but because in that moment it felt impossible to say anything else. The applause was immediate. Cheers. Hugs. Congratulations layered over me so quickly that there was no room left for reflection. Later, when I replayed it in my mind, I noticed what I had missed at the time. He did not look nervous. He did not look vulnerable. He looked proud. Not of us, but of the moment itself. Of how it landed. Of how it looked. From that point on, commitment became something to display. He talked about our engagement like an achievement. He shared it often. Retold the story with enthusiasm. Emphasized the reactions, the crowd, the surprise. Each time the focus stayed on how impressive it was, not how personal it felt. Wedding planning followed the same pattern. I imagined something intimate. Meaningful. A day that reflected who we were together. He imagined something grand. Expensive. Visually flawless. Guest lists grew. Venues became statements. Details mattered only if they impressed the right people. Whenever I suggested something simpler, he pushed back gently, framing it as practicality or image. This was about our future, he said. About how we were seen. About doing things properly. I noticed how often the word "we" really meant him. Decisions tilted in his favor. Preferences aligned with his tastes. My ideas were adjusted until they fit his vision. Each compromise was justified as necessary, as smart, as grown up. People admired us. They commented on how perfect everything looked. How lucky I was. How well he took charge. I smiled and nodded, letting the praise wash over us both. Even as a quiet discomfort settled in my chest. The commitment was real to me. The performance mattered more to him. I did not realize then that what I thought was a shared milestone was, to him, another stage. Another moment to be seen, admired, and applauded. By the time I understood that love should not feel like a production, I was already standing under bright lights, part of a story he was directing. Long before I knew how it would end. The planning phase was where everything quietly tilted. First, it felt collaborative. We sat together, scrolling through venues, discussing dates, tossing around ideas. He listened, nodded, even agreed with me in the beginning. I thought that meant we were aligned. Then the decision started sticking. When I suggested a smaller venue, something warm and personal, he paused and said it did not really fit what people would expect. When I mentioned keeping the guest list intimate, he reminded me how important networking was, how this was not just a wedding but a statement. Every time I offered an opinion, it was met with a reason it needed adjusting. Not rejecting. Refining. That word came up a lot. He refined my ideas until they barely resembled what I wanted. My preferences were never dismissed outright. They were just softened, reshaped, and redirected until his vision took priority. I noticed how often decisions were finalized without me. He would book appointments and tell me after. He would agree to upgrades I had not approved. He would speak to vendors confidently, using phrases like "we decided" and "we prefer," even when we had not discussed it. Standing beside him, I felt invisible, smiling politely while my role quietly shifted. When I pushed back, he stayed calm. He said I was stressing unnecessarily, that I should trust him, that he was just better at handling these things. His tone made it sound like a favor, like he was carrying a burden so I would not have to. I let him. I started deferring without thinking. If he wanted something different, I agreed. If he dismissed a detail that mattered to me, I convinced myself it was not worth the tension. It felt easier to let things go than to explain why they mattered. People praised his leadership. Friends commented on how organized he was. Family members thanked him for taking charge. Vendors addressed him first. I stood there nodding, holding notes I rarely got to use. My voice confirmed attendance. His voice made decisions. The shift was subtle but complete. I was no longer planning a wedding with him. I was participating in an event he was curating. The excitement I expected to feel was replaced with a low-level anxiety I could not name. Whenever I expressed doubt, he reminded me how far along we were. How much money had already been spent. How many people were involved. Backing out felt irresponsible. Questioning him felt ungrateful. So I stayed quiet. I told myself this was temporary. That once the day passed, things would balance again. That this was just stress, not a pattern. I did not realize that planning was not the problem. The problem was how easily my voice disappeared once something important was on the line. and how comfortable he was making choices that shaped my future without needing my agreement. By the time the plans were finalized, I could not tell where my vision ended and his control began, and that should have scared me more than it did. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, like a picture coming into focus after being blurry for too long. I started replaying moments I had dismissed before. Conversations that ended with me apologizing without fully understanding why. Decisions that were framed as mutual but never truly felt that way. Situations where my discomfort was acknowledged, then quietly overridden. Individually, none of it looked alarming. Together, it formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I noticed how often my needs came last. Not intentionally, not aggressively, but consistently. If something mattered to me and conflicted with what he wanted, it was always my concern that became negotiable. His preferences were fixed. Mine were flexible. That flexibility had a cost. I realized how often I had been preparing myself emotionally before speaking, rehearsing words in my head to make sure they sounded calm enough, reasonable enough, agreeable enough. I had learned to present my feelings in a way that would not threaten his comfort. That was not partnership. That was management. I thought about the way he handled disagreement. Not with anger but with control. He would listen, then redirect. Validate just enough to seem fair, then explain why his way still made more sense. By the end of the conversation I felt heard but unchanged. The clarity came in a quiet moment. I was alone, surrounded by plans that barely reflected me, thinking about a future that felt strangely distant. That was when I realized something unsettling. I had been adapting for so long that I no longer recognized where compromise ended and self-erasure began. I saw how much I had normalized discomfort. I had accepted being corrected in public, minimized in private, and praised only when I complied. I had mistaken his confidence for leadership and his calm for stability. I had trusted his certainty more than my intuition. That trust was misplaced. What made it clearer was not a single event but the consistency, the predictability. Every major decision followed the same script. Every disagreement ended the same way. Every moment of resistance was met with patience that slowly wore me down. I understood then that the public breakup was not out of character. It was the most honest thing he had ever done. Everything before it had been carefully managed, polished, and framed. This time the control was visible. The intention was exposed. The pattern completed itself in front of witnesses. I did not feel anger yet. I felt something more grounding. Recognition. Once you see a pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once I recognized what had been happening all along, I knew there was no version of this future where I would feel fully present, fully equal, or fully myself. That understanding changed everything. She did not start with sympathy. She started with honesty. We were sitting across from each other, coffee growing cold between us, the kind of silence that only happens when someone knows exactly what they are about to say might hurt. She had known me long before him, long before I learned how to soften my voice or second-guess my instincts. She looked at me carefully, not rushing, not dramatic. "I have been waiting for this moment," she said. That caught me off guard. She explained it gently, how she had watched me change over time, how the woman who used to speak without hesitation had started asking permission, how my confidence had not disappeared overnight, but faded slowly, like something dimmed one setting at a time. I wanted to defend him. The instinct was automatic. She noticed it and stopped me with a raised hand. Not unkind, just firm. "I am not saying he is a villain," she said. "I am saying you stopped sounding like yourself." That landed harder than any accusation. She reminded me of things I had forgotten. The way I used to argue my point and enjoy it. The way I trusted my judgment. The way I laughed without checking if it was appropriate. She said none of that vanished. It just got quieter as he got more comfortable being the loudest voice in the room. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with shame. She was not angry on my behalf. She was calm, observant, certain. She told me she had noticed how often I explained his behavior before anyone questioned it. How quickly I took responsibility for tension that did not start with me. How I had begun describing my own needs as inconveniences. "I did not say anything before," she admitted, "because you would not have heard it. And because I did not want to be another voice you felt you had to manage." That honesty stayed with me. It was not validation I felt. It was clarity. Hearing the truth from someone who had no agenda stripped away the last excuses I had been holding on to. She was not rewriting my story. She was reflecting it back to me without distortion. For the first time, I saw myself the way someone who loved me saw me. Not dramatic. Not difficult. Not too much. Just quieter than I used to be. That outside perspective did something powerful. It confirmed what I had been feeling but could not articulate. It gave shape to a discomfort I had been trained to dismiss. And once that truth was spoken out loud, it stopped being something I could ignore. It became something I could act on. The truth did not announce itself. It surfaced quietly, the way real betrayals usually do. Started with something small. A message that did not quite make sense. A detail that did not line up with what I had been told. First, I dismissed it. I had spent years explaining things away. Old habits do not disappear overnight. Then I noticed how prepared he had been. The timing of the breakup. The setting. The people present. The confidence in his voice. None of it felt impulsive anymore. It felt rehearsed. Like a scene he had already played out in his head. I began paying attention. I went back through conversations we had shared. Messages. Emails. Planning documents. Things we had both accessed without thinking much of it before. What I found was not dramatic at first. It was methodical. There were notes. Draft messages saved but never sent. Versions of explanations written in advance, polished and careful, framing the end of our relationship as something necessary and mature. Language designed to make him look reasonable. Language that quietly positioned me as the problem. I saw timestamps that made my stomach tighten. Messages created days before the wedding. Plans adjusted weeks earlier. A separate guest list labeled for updates. Names of people who had been present at the restaurant, placed there deliberately. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and undeniable. This was not a moment. It was a strategy. I found conversations with his friends that confirmed what I had started to suspect. Casual messages referencing the day as if it were an event. Jokes about how uncomfortable it might get. One message mentioned recording just in case. Just in case of what? Just in case I cried. Just in case I begged. Just in case I proved whatever story he wanted to tell. The worst part was how calm the planning was. There was no anger in those messages. No hesitation. Just coordination. Like arranging seating at a dinner party. Like organizing a presentation. I realized then why he needed witnesses. This was never about honesty. It was about control. About creating a version of events he could circulate immediately, backed by an audience and potentially footage. He wanted proof of my reaction, not closure. As I read through everything, a strange calm settled over me. Not relief. Not rage. Understanding. Every moment that had confused me before began to make sense. The emotional distance. The subtle pulling away. The sudden confidence with which he ended things publicly. He was not bracing himself for fallout. He was executing a plan. I stopped scrolling when I reached a message that confirmed it beyond doubt. A short line sent before we even arrived at the restaurant. It mentioned timing, visibility, making sure everyone was there. There was no mention of my feelings. No concern about the impact. Just logistics. That was when the shock finally reached my body. My hands trembled. My chest tightened. The weight of it all pressed down at once. Not because I had been left, but because I had been positioned. Set up. Reduced to a role in someone else's narrative. And still, I felt something unexpected underneath it all. Power. Because now I knew. And once you see the preparation behind the betrayal, you stop questioning yourself. The public breakup was not cruelty born from emotion. It was intention. And intention leaves evidence. He thought planning would protect him. He believed preparation meant control. What he did not understand was that by documenting his own strategy, he had handed me clarity. He had revealed exactly who he was, not in a moment of weakness, but in the quiet confidence of planning. And that truth changed the balance completely. I did not confront him. I did not ask for explanations. I did not demand answers. I went quiet. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. I had spent so long explaining myself, smoothing things over, responding quickly so nothing escalated. Not replying felt like stepping outside a script I had followed for years. His messages started carefully. He checked in, asked if I was okay, suggested we should talk like adults. The tone was calm, measured, as if he was still in control of the situation. I read each message once, then set my phone down without responding. That was the first shift. The messages changed after that. Questions replaced statements. Confidence softened into uncertainty. He wanted to understand why I was acting this way, why I was not reacting the way he expected. He mentioned how strange my silence felt, how unlike me it was. He was right. It was unlike the version of me he was used to. I noticed how much space the silence created. Without his voice filling the gaps, my thoughts became clearer. I no longer had to manage his reactions or anticipate his responses. I could think without interruption. That clarity felt powerful. Silence took away his audience. It denied him feedback. It left him without proof of the reaction he had planned to collect. Without my response, his narrative stalled. There was nothing dramatic to point to, nothing emotional to circulate. I could almost feel the control slipping. He tried different approaches. Concern, know-how, subtle frustration. Each message revealed more about his expectations than my behavior ever could. He needed engagement to maintain authority, and I was no longer providing it. For the first time, the power dynamic reversed. I was not withholding silence as punishment. I was using it as protection. Silence was not passive. It was deliberate. It was a boundary he could not cross without my permission. In that quiet space, I reclaimed something I had lost. Agency. I realized how often my responses had kept things running smoothly for him. How my explanations had softened his actions. How my emotional labor had filled in the gaps he created. Without my voice, his certainty unraveled. The silence did not erase what happened. It reframed it. It shifted the balance from reaction to choice. I was no longer responding to his plan. I was stepping out of it entirely. And that was when it became clear. Silence was not weakness. It was refusal. Refusal to perform. Refusal to justify. Refusal to give him anything else to use. The more I stayed quiet, the louder his intentions became. And for the first time, that noise was no longer my responsibility to manage. Once the noise faded, reality stepped in. There were practical things that needed handling, details I had avoided thinking about because they felt too heavy before. Now strangely, they grounded me. Tasks gave structure to a moment that could have easily dissolved into chaos. I started with the obvious. Shared accounts, bookings, contracts tied to both our names. Each one felt like a thread connecting me to a version of life that no longer existed. I approached them calmly, one at a time, refusing to rush or spiral. I did not want to move from panic. I wanted to move from clarity. I made lists. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. Things to cancel. Things to transfer. Things to confirm. The simplicity of it surprised me. Each checkbox felt like a quiet reclaiming of space. Some conversations were uncomfortable. Vendors asked careful questions. Family members hesitated before speaking. Friends did not always know what to say. I answered simply, without defending myself or explaining more than necessary. The story did not need embellishment. The truth was enough. I noticed how differently people responded when I stayed composed. There was no pity in their tone. No awkward sympathy. Just respect. That shift mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that dignity does not need justification. Speaks on its own. As I untangled shared responsibilities, I also untangled habits. I stopped checking my phone reflexively. I stopped rehearsing responses I would never send. I rearranged my space, moving things that reminded me of compromises I had made without realizing it. The changes were subtle, but they felt intentional. I revisited plans I had postponed, ideas I had set aside because they did not align with us, interests I had muted because they caused friction. I did not jump back into everything at once. I just acknowledged that those parts of me still existed. That acknowledgement felt like progress. There was a moment late one evening when I sat alone, surrounded by paperwork and half-packed boxes, and realized something important. I was not untangling chaos. I was untangling control. The complexity I had feared was mostly emotional, not logistical. Once the emotional weight lifted, the rest became manageable. I felt clearer with each step. More grounded. Less reactive. The future no longer felt like something I had to brace myself for. It felt open, unassigned, waiting. This was not rebuilding yet. This was preparation. I was separating what was shared from what was mine. Creating clean edges where everything had once been blurred. Making space for decisions that would be made with my voice, not filtered through someone else's approval. Untangling a shared life was not about erasing the past. It was about making sure the future belonged entirely to me. I knew if I stayed silent forever, the story would be written without me. That did not mean I needed to argue, defend myself, or explain every detail. It meant I needed to be intentional, calm, strategic. I was not interested in controlling the narrative through force. I wanted the truth to stand on its own, so I chose my timing. I did not rush to correct assumptions or chase rumors. I let the noise settle. People always talk in the beginning, filling gaps with guesses. I trusted that rushing would only feed speculation. Clarity works best when it arrives without panic. When I did speak, I kept it simple. I did not rehearse speeches or prepare dramatic statements. I shared facts when asked. Nothing more. Nothing less. I described what happened without emotion layered on top, letting the contrast between expectation and reality speak for itself. The effects surprised me. People leaned in when I stayed measured. They listened more closely when I did not try to convince them. The absence of defensiveness made room for understanding. I watched perception shift quietly, not because I demanded it, but because consistency does the work words cannot. I also made a deliberate choice about visibility. I did not disappear. I showed up where it mattered. Calm, composed, present. I did not look broken or angry. I did not look like someone hiding. I looked like someone who had already moved forward. That mattered. There is power in being seen without explaining yourself. I noticed how questions changed over time. Early curiosity gave way to something more thoughtful. People stopped asking what went wrong and started asking how I was doing. That shift told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer a reaction to his actions. I was my own reference point. Reclaiming the narrative did not mean rewriting the past. It meant refusing to let it define me. I did not need to expose every detail or reveal every truth I had uncovered. Selective transparency was enough. I shared what was necessary. I withheld what was private. That balance protected my peace. I realized that the most effective response to manipulation is not exposure for exposure's sake. It is stability. It is restraint. It is choosing when and how to speak rather than reacting on cue. In that space, something shifted permanently. I was no longer waiting for his version of events to fade. I was living in a way that made it irrelevant. The story people saw was not one of loss or humiliation. It was one of clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. Reclaiming the narrative was not about winning. It was about ownership. And once I took that back, there was nothing left for anyone else to take from me. The reckoning did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with contrast. I did not announce anything. I did not call anyone out. I did not correct the story publicly or post explanations where they did not belong. I simply showed up as myself, unchanged in tone, steady in presence. That alone unsettled the narrative he had prepared. People expected distance, withdrawal, visible damage. Instead, they saw calm consistency. They saw me continuing my life without urgency, without bitterness, without spectacle. That quiet contradiction planted the first seed of doubt. Questions began to surface naturally. Not accusations. Not gossip. Just curiosity. People who had been present that day replayed it in their minds, noticing details they had missed before. The lack of drama where drama had been expected. The absence of tears. The way I had left without argument. When they asked what happened, I answered plainly. I did not embellish. I did not dramatize. I described the facts as they were. Where it happened. Who was there. What was said. I spoke with the same calm I had maintained since the beginning. No anger. No revenge in my voice. That restraint mattered. Truth lands differently when it is not forced. Some people listened quietly, nodding as pieces clicked into place. Others asked careful follow-up questions. I answered those too without rushing, without trying to win them over. I trusted that clarity did not need performance. I noticed how the energy shifted. Conversations that once felt awkward became thoughtful. Expressions changed from confusion to discomfort, not with me but with him. People began revisiting their assumptions without being prompted. It was not my words that did the work. It was consistency. The truth revealed itself through repetition, not emphasis. Every calm response, every composed appearance, every moment I refused to act wounded reinforced the same message. I was not hiding anything. I was not unstable. I was not reacting because I had nothing to defend. That unsettled people more than anger ever could. Eventually the questions reached him. I did not hear them directly, but I felt the shift in how others spoke. The way his name was mentioned less confidently. The way explanations sounded thinner when repeated. The way silence began to follow his version of events. I never had to challenge his story. I only had to exist alongside it. The contrast made it fragile. People began noticing inconsistencies on their own. The planning, the audience, the confidence with which he ended things publicly. Details that once felt dramatic now felt calculated when viewed without emotion. That was the reckoning. Not a moment, but a realization spreading quietly through shared conversations. Not an attack but a collapse of credibility. His version required reaction to survive. Mine did not. I watched as distance formed naturally. Friends who had been enthusiastic grew reserved. Support turned cautious. Certainty softened into questions. The story he had controlled so carefully no longer held its shape. And still I said nothing more than necessary. I did not need to escalate. I did not need to prove anything. The truth had space now, and it was filling it on its own. That was the power of not attacking. By refusing to perform anger, I removed the distraction. By staying calm, I let the facts speak. By stepping back, I allowed people to arrive at their own conclusions. The reckoning was public, but it was quiet. And when it passed, I realized something important. The truth does not need force when it is finally given room to breathe. I knew he would not stay quiet forever. Control does not disappear easily. It looks for another opening. The first attempt came subtly. A message framed as concern. He asked if I was okay, if I was handling things well, if I needed support. The words were careful, chosen to sound reasonable. To sound like the calm one. The same role he always preferred to play. I did not respond. That is when the tone shifted. Concern turned into confusion. Confusion turned into irritation. He said my silence was unnecessary, that it was making things awkward. He suggested we should clear the air, talk things through, behave like adults. The implication was clear. My refusal to engage was now the problem. Still I stayed quiet. When that did not work, the accusations began. He said I was being cold, that I was exaggerating what happened, that people were getting the wrong idea because I was not correcting them. He implied I was enjoying the attention, that I was subtly turning people against him without saying anything at all. That irony did not escape me. For years he had shaped perception through suggestion, timing, and tone. Now, faced with the same silence he once relied on, he was unraveling. He tried to reframe the story. He claimed the breakup was mutual, then necessary, then misunderstood. Each version contradicted the last. The certainty he once carried fractured under pressure. Without my reaction to anchor his narrative, it drifted. I noticed how desperate his need for engagement had become. He wanted a response. Any response. Anger would have satisfied him. Tears would have validated him. Even defense would have given him something to work with. Silence gave him nothing. That is why the accusations failed. They had no audience. People had already seen me composed, grounded, consistent. His sudden urgency clashed with the image he had tried to maintain. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He began reaching out through others. Mutual friends mentioned that he was confused, hurt, frustrated by my lack of communication. Some suggested I should at least hear him out. I listened politely and declined, calmly, without explanation. That refusal spoke louder than any argument. The more he pushed, the less convincing he became. Control relies on access. Influence requires participation. I offered neither. What surprised me most was how little power he actually had once I stepped out of the dynamic. Without my cooperation, His accusations floated without weight. They did not land because there was nothing solid to attach them to. No reaction. No proof. No performance. In trying to regain control, he exposed how much of it depended on my engagement. And when that realization settled, I felt something unmistakable. Freedom. Not because he had stopped trying, but because his efforts no longer reached me. Control only works when you are inside it. I was already gone. The consequences did not arrive loudly. They arrived quietly, the way reputations usually fall apart. First, it was subtle. Conversations shifted when his name came up. People hesitated before agreeing with him. The certainty that once surrounded his words began to thin. Where there had been confidence, there was now caution. I noticed it before anyone said anything directly. Friends who once spoke about him with admiration started using neutral language. Supportive nods turned into non-committal pauses. Stories he told no longer landed the way they used to. People listened, but they did not fully lean in. Credibility is fragile when it relies on control. The more he tried to explain himself, the more questions surfaced. His versions changed depending on the audience. What had once sounded decisive now felt defensive. What had once felt composed now felt rehearsed. People remembered things. Small moments they had brushed off before. His need to perform. His comfort with public spectacle. The way he had chosen timing and witnesses so carefully. The absence of emotion where emotion should have been. When they compared that memory to my silence, something did not add up. I did not need to say anything. The contrast did the work for me. His circle began to shrink. Invitations slowed. Conversations cooled. The same people who had once laughed along with his confidence now exchanged glances when he spoke. He noticed. I could tell. Control does not vanish overnight. It erodes. I heard through others that he felt misunderstood. That people were not giving him the benefit of the doubt anymore. That he was frustrated by how quickly perception had changed without any dramatic event to point to. That was the part he could not accept. There had been no explosion. No accusation. No public takedown. Just a steady unraveling caused by inconsistency meeting clarity. Reputation collapses when behavior can no longer hide behind charm. People began trusting patterns over explanations. They noticed who stayed calm and who kept rewriting the story. They noticed who moved forward quietly and who stayed stuck trying to manage perception. His need to control the narrative became the narrative. What once worked against me now worked against him. The patience he had used to wear me down no longer impressed anyone. It read as manipulation when the audience changed. I saw the consequences not as punishment, but as inevitability. Truth does not chase people. It waits. And once it is visible, it does not need help. The collapse was not dramatic. It was quiet, social, incremental. The kind that cannot be argued away because it is built from observation, not opinion. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. Just confirmation. Confirmation that control cannot survive without participation. Confirmation that silence, when chosen deliberately, exposes more than confrontation ever could. By the time the consequences were obvious, I was already far enough removed to see them clearly. They were no longer mine to carry. They belonged entirely to him. What surprised me most was not how everything ended, but how quietly I healed afterward. There was no dramatic turning point. No single morning where I woke up and felt whole again. Healing arrived in small, unremarkable moments. A day when his name did not tighten my chest. An evening when I laughed without checking my phone. A choice made without wondering whether someone else would approve. That was growth. I stopped measuring my worth through anyone else's certainty. I stopped replaying conversations, searching for what I should have said differently. I accepted that clarity does not always come before pain. Sometimes pain is what clears your vision. Freedom felt subtle at first. It showed up as ease, as space, as the absence of tension I had mistaken for normal. I realized how much energy I had spent managing reactions, maintaining balance, staying agreeable. Without that weight, life felt lighter than I expected. I did not rush into anything new. I took my time rebuilding trust, starting with myself. I paid attention to my instincts again. I listened when something felt off. I honored my voice even when it shook. Especially when it shook. Closure did not come from a conversation. Came from understanding. I understood that love should not require an audience, that commitment should not feel like a performance, that respect is not something you negotiate for or earn through compliance. It is something that either exists or does not. I stopped asking why he did what he did. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was what I learned. I learned that calm is powerful, that silence can protect, that walking away with dignity can change the entire outcome of a story without saying a single harsh word. I did not get revenge in the way people expect. I got something better. I got myself back. The woman who walked out of that public moment did not disappear. She evolved. She learned where her boundaries were. She learned how easily love can be confused with control, and how important it is to notice the difference early. If there is a moral in all of this, it is simple. Do not mistake composure for weakness. Do not mistake silence for surrender. And do not stay where your voice keeps shrinking. Some endings feel like loss because they happen publicly, but sometimes what looks like humiliation is actually release. What feels like rejection is redirection. What seems like an ending is simply the moment you stop performing and start choosing yourself. I did not walk away bitter. I walked away free. And that peace has been worth everything.